Welcome to my Knitting 101 tutorial. My name's Juliana Lustenader. I'm a knitwear designer based in San Francisco, California, and today I want to teach you how to knit. First I'm going to teach you how to cast on, then I'm going to teach you the knit stitch and the purl stitch, and how to bind off, and finally weave in your ends. Before we can do any of that though, you're going to need some materials. The most important material, of course, is your yarn. There is no knitting without beautiful yarn. Today I'm using a light gray 100% merino wool in a worsted weight. Worsted weight just means medium weight or average weight. This is the most accessible yarn that you'll find in a craft store, easily found. I recommend you pick a light color like a light gray or a white or a cream, maybe a yellow, so you can see your stitches and you can see the different strands of yarn. If you pick a dark color like navy blue or black, it's harder to see these strands and it's harder to see your stitches. I also recommend you pick a solid color. You don't want yarn that's changing colors as you go. It's going to confuse you as a beginner. And I recommend you stay away from anything too fuzzy. Next, you'll need some knitting needles. Today I'm using straight bamboo needles in size US 7. And I'm using this size because it's the size recommended for the yarn I've chosen. If I were using thicker yarn, like a bulky weight yarn, I would need bigger needles, like US 9, US 10, whatever was recommended on the label of the yarn. I'm also using straight needles today. Even though needles can come in circular and double-pointed, straight needles are a great place to start. And I recommend you use a bamboo or wooden needle like this one instead of plastic or metal. Plastic and metal needles are very slippery, and it's great if you know what you're doing and you want to go quick. But when you're learning, I recommend you use bamboo or wooden needles because your stitches will stay on the needle a lot better. You're also going to need a darning needle. It doesn't matter if this one's plastic or metal in my opinion. They're all pretty great. I just recommend you use a darning needle and not a sewing needle because a darning needle has a much bigger eye and they usually have a curved tip. It's fine if it's a straight tip. It's just easier to use if you have a curved one. And last but not least, a pair of perfectly sharp scissors to cut your yarn. Now that you have your materials, you're ready to cast on. The first step of every knitting project is a slip knot. It's a simple loop that you create with yarn. You don't even use the needles yet. The first step of making a slip knot is finding your tail end, which has the end here, and your working end, which is the yarn coming from the ball that you're knitting from. First thing you do is make a loop, putting the tail end on top of the working end. And there's our loop. You see the tail end is on top. Then, from the back of this loop, with your fingers and your thumb, go ahead and grab the working yarn and pull it through by tightening the tail end. And you've made a little loop. If you put it on your finger, you can tighten it with your working yarn just by pulling on it. That's how you know you've done it right. Thing is, we're not going to knit with our fingers, we're going to knit with knitting needles. So, go ahead and put your newfound slip knot on a needle and give it a little tug. You don't want it too tight because this is your very first stitch of your first knitting project. Congratulations! Now that you've done a slip knot and made your very first stitch and put it on your needle, you're ready to cast on. There are hundreds of ways to cast on in knitting. Today I'm going to teach you the most basic cast on method, which is called the backwards loop method cast on, or BLCO. It's the easiest because it has the least amount of steps, and here they are. First, have your working yarn in your left hand and your needle in your right hand. Have the needle pointing towards your left hand for some ease here. Take your working yarn, and a lot like what we did with our slip knot, we're going to make a loop with it. This time, we're going to put the working yarn over like that. It kind of looks like a 4. You want to make sure that the yarn coming from the ball is on top of this yarn here. Then I'm simply going to put my needle into this loop and tighten with my left hand. until it's nice and snug, like our first stitch. Be sure not to pull too tight because that's going to make knitting our first row a little hard. We want these stitches to be just loose enough where we can move them around, but not so loose that it looks like you got ramen noodles on your needles. Let's do that cast on again. Working yarn over, needle in the loop, and pull. We have 3 stitches on our needles. You can count your stitches by counting the little loops that are on your needles. Let's do it again. We're going to cast on, let's do 30 stitches for our swatch. Once you get the hang of this cast on, it goes pretty quickly. Here, I just want to show you, this is what the edge looks like, so you can get a sense of what we're doing here. How many have we done? 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. Okay, we're going to do a bunch more. Once you've cast on the number of stitches that is indicated in your pattern, in this case 30 for us, you've finished casting on. Congratulations! You're ready to knit your first row. In order to knit your first row, you need to have an empty needle in your right hand and the already casted on needle in your left. So we're going to turn this needle around and put it in our left hand like this. You'll have your working yarn over here on the right side. You'll have the tail on the left hanging, doing its thing. And you'll have an empty needle in your right hand. Go ahead and move your stitches close to the edge of your left needle like this. There are multiple ways to knit. The 2 main ones are called continental knitting and English style knitting. Continental knitting requires that you hold your working yarn in your left hand, while English style requires that you hold your working yarn in your right. I am more comfortable with the latter method, so today I'm going to be holding my yarn in my right hand while I show you how to do the knit stitch. So here we go. You got all these lovely cast on stitches on this needle in your left hand, and you have an empty needle in your right. Using the point of your right needle, go into this very first stitch on your left hand needle. You're going to go into it from the front left. Go ahead and put your point through that stitch and in the back. You're going to make it like an X shape with your needles. Make sure that it's gone all the way through that stitch. You don't want to be splitting your yarn here. Go ahead and grab your yarn in your right hand or whatever hand you'd like to use for this, and wrap the yarn around that back needle counterclockwise. So see, I'm going this direction. Once you've done that, carefully with your right hand, pull the needle down and get the yarn through the loop like this. You'll know you've done this right because you'll have your right needle in front of your left now, still in that X shape. The last thing you do is slip that stitch off the left hand needle. You have 1 stitch knit on your right hand needle. Let's do it again. With the yarn in back, take your right needle, go in front and to the left of the next stitch. Get the point through that loop and behind your left hand needle. Get your working yarn ready and wrap it counterclockwise around that back needle. Slowly pull the needle and the yarn through the loop and in the front, making an X shape. And last but not least, slip off the stitch off the left hand needle. You have 2 stitches now, 2 knit stitches. Let's keep going. In, around, through, and off. In, around, through, and off. I'll do another one slowly. I'm going in the front to the left, through that stitch, and behind. That's going to be hard to do if that stitch is too tight, which is why our cast on is a little loose. We don't want it too tight. Wrapping my yarn counterclockwise, pulling it through, and slipping the stitch off. Go ahead and knit every single stitch on your needles, like so. Oh, not like so. See, I split my yarn there. You got to be careful not to do that. Go through the whole stitch. Make sure you're not splitting your yarn. Wrap, pull, and off. Now that I'm coming to the end, I want to show you how the end of the row is going to finish. We're knitting these last few stitches. I'm being very careful not to let a stitch slip off my left-hand needle until after I've knitted. In the last stitch, I'm going through the front, wrapping, pulling through, and slipping off. Go ahead and count your stitches on your right-hand needle. There should still be 30 stitches, or however many you cast it on. You should not have more or less. If you have more, you probably added a loop somewhere along the way. If you have less, you probably dropped a stitch. Before we knit our second row, we're going to do the same thing we did before we knit our first row, which was flipping our work, putting the empty needle in our right hand, and the needle covered with stitches in our left. You should have your working yarn on this right side here. You'll see there's a tail hanging. Make sure you are not knitting with the tail. You're going to run out of yarn before you finish the row. You want to make sure that your working yarn is the yarn that you're wrapping around your needle as you're doing these knit stitches. We're going to knit every stitch in this next row, so you can see the texture that it makes. Here we go. Just like the first row, we're going to have our working yarn in our right hand, and this empty needle is going to go into the front of the first stitch on the left needle and behind, making an X. We're going to wrap counterclockwise, pull it through, and slip it off. Being really careful not to let this stitch slip off the right needle, and not to let any stitches on the left needle slip off the edge either. Continue on and knit every stitch. I'm on the last stitch of my second row. I'm just going to knit that stitch like I've been doing all the others. And here we are. We still have 30 stitches on this needle, and we have an empty needle in our left hand. You'll know that you're doing this right, knitting every stitch of every row, when you get these bumps here. It makes a ridge of bumps on both sides. You see the little bumps? If you keep doing this, if you knit every single row, every stitch of every single row, you're going to create a bumpy looking texture that we call garter stitch. Garter stitch is great for all sorts of projects. Scarves, hats, sweaters. It's a very common stitch. Now that you know the knit stitch, you can go ahead and knit anything. You could knit a washcloth right now. You could knit a scarf right now. I'm going to go ahead and knit every single stitch and every row on this so I can show you a garter stitch swatch. Okay, I've knitted a few more rows, haven't I? This is the garter stitch, and you know it's garter when you see all these bumps on one side and they look exactly the same on the other side. That's what's pretty cool about the knit stitch. If you knit every single stitch for every single row, you can go ahead and keep knitting. Just knit, 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 knit until you feel super comfortable with the stitch. And don't worry if on your very first swatch ever, your stitches down here look loose or too tight, or you got like a hole somewhere. Just keep practicing the knit stitch until you feel really, really comfortable. I would recommend maybe doing an all garter stitch scarf to start, or if you're concerned that you might not ever finish that scarf, which is a real concern, you could just knit a square like I'm going to and use it as a washcloth around your house, or maybe a pot holder. Those make for great first projects, but I recommend you just keep knitting, 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 knitting until you feel really comfortable with that, and then you can move on to other stitches like the purl stitch. Now that you know how to do the knit stitch, you might want to learn how to do the purl stitch. The purl stitch is known as the exact opposite of the knit stitch, and it is in many ways. You do the opposite movements to create a different looking stitch. Here in front of me, you'll see I have a swatch in the making, and I have this texture on the bottom, which should look familiar to you. This is garter stitch. And in this stitch, I knitted every single stitch on the right side and every single stitch on the wrong side. But here in the middle is a different stitch. This is called stockinette stitch. And this is created by knitting all the stitches on one side, usually the right side, and then purling all the stitches on the way back with the wrong side facing us. So this is the right side, which means I'm going to be knitting all of these stitches in my next row. And this is the wrong side. You can tell where the garter stitches are because these bumps are less dense than the bumps in the middle created by the purl stitch. But this is how you make stockinette stitch. First, you're going to knit all the stitches in this row when you have the right side facing you. Whoopsie daisy, there we go. Knit every single one, including those garter stitch borders if you're copying me here. I'm doing garter stitch for the first and last 4 stitches of this swatch with stockinette in the center. Okay, I finished my knit row, so I'm going to turn my work and have the wrong side face me. My working yarn is over on the right side, and I have an empty needle in my right hand. For the first 4 stitches I'm going to knit, because that's what created that garter pattern on the edge of the swatch. I've knit 4. Now I'm going to purl. The first thing you do before you purl anything, you get this working yarn in the front of your work. And I'm doing that by putting it between these stitches. I'm not going over my needle to get it in the front because that's going to make a problem. You want the working yarn to go right in the middle and in the front. You're still holding it in your right hand if you're doing English style, or you're holding it in your left hand if you're doing continental. But this is the English way. So I have my working yarn in the front. With my right needle, I'm going to go into this first stitch, but instead of going in the front like I did with the knit stitch, I'm going to go from this direction through that loop and into that front part. So I'm not doing this and going like that and making the X we did with knitting. I'm going from this right side and crossing in front. There's our X. With our yarn, we're going to wrap it counterclockwise again. So it goes in the back and around. Then I'm going to slowly move that right needle down, pulling the yarn to the back and crossing in the back. Last but not least, slip the stitch off. And you have 1 purl stitch. Here, let me show you what that looks like. It looks like a little bump. That's your purl stitch. Let's do it again. Working yarn in front. Right needle goes through on the right side, remember, not over here on the left like we did before, but from the right and in front. Wrap the right hand needle counterclockwise. Pull the yarn through into the back with your right hand needle and slip it off. So the main ways this is the opposite of the knit stitch. You have your yarn in the front. You got your right hand needle going through the other side of the stitch than we did before. The same thing is you're always wrapping your yarn counterclockwise. But then, when you pull the yarn through, you're crossing your right hand needle behind your left hand needle to make that X shape that we always want. And then we're slipping it off. Go ahead and purl the amount of stitches you're supposed to. In my case, I'm going to purl all these center stitches until I have 4 stitches left on my left hand needle. Then I'm going to knit those. Alright, I finished purling. I have 4 stitches left on my left hand needle, and I want to knit these. So what do I have to do? I have to get this working yarn, which is currently in the front, and move it to the back. I'm going to do that between my needles, just like that. I'm not going over and getting that yarn in the back because that's making an extra loop on my needles that I don't want. I'm putting it between my needles and into the back. I'm going to knit these last 4. And then I'm going to see how pretty it looks on the right side. Ta-da! If I wanted to purl on the right side, it's going to look like these little bumps. And if I wanted to knit on the wrong side, it's going to look like these little V's. Each of these V's here, I'm going to use this needle to show you. Each of these little V's represents a stitch. It also represents a row. If you needed to count your rows, you could count all these little V's. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, so on and so forth. Here, I'm going to show you what a purl stitch looks like on the front. Let's go ahead and knit a whole bunch here and pretend we want to add a rogue purl right here. I'm going to move my yarn in the front, go in this direction, wrap, out the back, slip off. I'm going to knit a few more. And see, there's your purl stitch. It sticks out. It's a great way to create texture in your piece. That's how you purl. The exact opposite, almost, of a knit stitch. Now that you know how to cast on, knit, and purl, it's time to teach you how to bind off, or cast off. Binding off or casting off is the last thing you do for any flat project like this. It's the act of binding off these live stitches, so they are no longer loose loops and you have a nice finished product. There are hundreds of ways to bind off your work. Today I'm going to teach you the simplest way I know how to do it, which is the classic lifted bind off. And you can do this either by knitting all these stitches, purling all these stitches, maybe knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 2, purl 2, totally up to you. I like to bind off in pattern. So in this case, I would be knitting all of these stitches if I was still going on in my work. So I'm going to knit the stitches as I'm binding them off. And here's what I mean. Go ahead and knit 2 stitches. You know you've done that when you have 2 loops on your right hand needle. With your left needle, pick up the first stitch you knitted and move it all the way over and off the right hand needle. It'll be pulled off on top of the second stitch you knitted. And you know you've done it right when you have 1 loop left on your right hand needle and your working yarn can control the tightness of that loop. We're going to keep going. We're going to knit 1 stitch this time until we have 2 stitches on our right hand needle, and we're going to take our left needle, pick up the first stitch on the right hand needle, move it over and off like that. We've bound off 2 stitches. I can tell because I see 1 V here and 1 V there. Let's keep going. Knit, pick it up, slip it over and off. Knit, pick it up, over, off. You're just going to keep doing this all the way to the end of the row. And you'll start to see this pretty, almost like a chain of V's. That's your bind off. Anytime you have 2 stitches on your right hand needle, that's how you know it's time to lift, over, and off. If you only have 1 stitch, you know you need to knit 1 more, and then you can lift, over, and off. Okay, we're getting to the end. I have 2 stitches on my right hand needle now. Lift, over, and off. There's one more left to knit. Lift over and off. I have an empty needle here. I'm going to put it to the side. And I have one loop left on my right needle. What I'm going to do is pull that loop extra loose, put that needle down and pick up my scissors, leaving a bit of a tail just like we did in the beginning with our cast on. I'm going to cut the yarn, find where that loop is, and pull my working yarn, or my tail now, through that loop and tight, like that. That closes off that last loop for us. And there I have it. I have a little swatch. Here's our bind off edge. Here's our cast on edge. The right side and the wrong side. We're not totally done until we weave in these ends. We can't just have a swatch with these little tassels, at least that wasn't the plan. So we're going to get rid of those. We need our darning needle now. The first step to weaving in your ends is getting your darning needle, choosing an end, and putting the end through the darning needle like a sewing needle. Get it through the eye, like that. You can tie a knot if you'd like for extra security here. That's up to you. I do find that if there is a knot here, it's a lot harder for me to pull the yarn through the holes that I need to pull it through. I like to weave in my ends by hiding them on the back of my work. I also like to follow where the yarn is going as I weave in my ends. You'll see that this strand here goes under this little bump here. That is a great place for me to weave in my ends because it's on the wrong side. I'm just going to follow that strand. Push the needle through and pull the yarn through. That's going to pull that a little bit back, which I think is going to make the corner look really nice. I'm going to keep following that thread. I see it curves and goes this way now, so I'm going to follow it and go through that bump like that. I'm going to keep following that thread I found. So it looks like now it goes and makes a V behind this V. So I'm going to put my needle like that to wrap around those two legs. And then it goes back down like this. You can keep following that pattern of the garter stitch just for a few more. And I think that's just enough. You can keep weaving in your end even more if you want for added security, but I find I usually don't need to do more than a few stitches. And now I can cut it away. And it's gone. Bye-bye. Nope, bye-bye. You've been dismissed. There. The end is gone. The corner looks pretty clean. I'm happy with that. So let's weave in the other one. This was our tail that we created with our cast on. I'm going to get it through the eye of my darning needle here. This is the right side of my work. I want this end to be hidden back here. So let's see where we have a good thread to follow. It's a little tougher, I find, on the cast on edge. I'm liking this second row here. I'm gonna follow those knit stitches a lot like what we did earlier. I see a strand here. It goes around these two legs of that stitch, so I'm gonna pull it through like that and keep following it through this bump and following that thread into this bump. Then I'm gonna go behind these two legs here and into that bump. And let's do one more. Yeah, pretty good. Snippy, snippy. And there. The swatch has its ends woven in. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you had a great time learning how to knit with me today. Today we went over casting on, the knit stitch, the purl stitch, binding off, and weaving in our ends. If you have any questions, please comment below. There are so many tricks and tips for learning how to knit that I probably didn't cover everything, so please comment below and I'm happy to help any way I can. Please give this video a like, subscribe to this channel, Knit by Jules, and check out my patterns on Ravelry, Lovecrafts, and Payhip. You can also follow me on Instagram at knitbyjules. Thanks again, and happy knitting!